very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Max Bruce. I'm from the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau within the City of London Police. And today we're going to be talking about online fraud. What's the evolution of online fraud? What are some of the tactics we're seeing? Maybe how you can better protect yourselves, and then what will the future look like? And I'm joined by some really great panelists today to discuss those topics with you. But what's really important is that we also get your engagement. So what I'm going to quickly do is just pass over to my colleague Richard from City of London Police, and he's going to tell you about how you guys can engage with us this afternoon.
Yeah, hi everyone, thanks for joining us. Like Max said, we want this to be as interactive with you guys as possible. So for those of you that didn't join us for the first session last week or haven't used them before, I'm just going to run through the options that you've actually got throughout this session, throughout this hour. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll have a Q&A section and a chat section. If you go into the Q&A box, you'll notice that you can actually type questions to our panelists, of which myself and Dave from Cyber Griffin here will be monitoring as the session moves forward. Feel free to answer questions as well if you want to do that. We will try to answer as many as we can during this hour, but it's likely that we probably won't get to them all. So feel free to answer some questions in there if you feel that you can do that as well. You can also vote on a question that you like to push it further up the list, so it becomes more important. And obviously, the more votes a question gets, the more chance there is of then that being asked in the session. Also, you'll notice the chat box function. If you open that up, you should see a section come up on the side of your screen there. You've got some information there just introducing you to all of our amazing panelists today. And you can also get involved in a chat or write questions to panelists or panelists and all attendees. And that option is there for you down at the bottom, just above the text box. However, this is a police event, and as you will see by the top of the screen, we are recording it. So please bear in mind the rule of the internet, and that is that if you don't want it on there recorded forever, then don't put it on there in the first place. And that's basically it. So I hope you have a fantastic session. Thanks, Max.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Okay, guys, so now I'd love to introduce the panelists to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each one to introduce themselves and just tell me a little bit about your role, and then maybe a little bit about maybe what your organisation or your department does. So firstly, I'd like to introduce to you Professor Mark Button. How are you, Mark?
Hello, I'm fine, yes. Well, obviously I'm Professor Mark Button. I run the Centre for Counter-Fraud Studies at the University of Portsmouth. We have a range of courses that's focused on counter-fraud, and we also do a great deal of research around fraud-related issues.
Great, thank you for joining us. Okay, next I'd like to introduce Amber Burridge. How are you?
Hello there. I'm going to have to shout because I don't think my microphone's working very well at the moment. So I am the Head of Fraud Intelligence at Cifas. I've been in the organisation for about 3 years now. However, I have over a decade of experience in kind of crime and fraud analysis. And part of my role within Cifas now is to try and identify those fraud threats and risks for members and try and preempt them in such a way. And it's great to have the conversation today around kind of online fraud, because obviously for us, that is such an important issue. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today about it.
Okay, well, thank you again for joining us. And finally, David Vint, how are you?
Yeah, good afternoon. Very well, thank you. Yourself?
Very good, thank you.
Yeah, a bit about myself. My name's Dave Vint. I've been a police officer for 15 years, last 5 years of which I've specialised in economic crime, with the majority of those crimes being at least cyber enabled. I'm currently the Detective Inspector in the DCPCU, which is dedicated card and payment crime unit. This is a proactive policing unit that's funded by UK Finance, which is the trade association for the financial sector. We're made up of officers from the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police. And the key areas of work that we currently focus on are card not present, so your remote purchase fraud, social engineering, so all of your ishings, your smishing, your phishings and your vishings, your dodgy text messages, emails and phone calls, and also authorised push payments, APP fraud.
Well,
and hopefully I'll answer any of your questions around relating to cybercrime.
Excellent, cheers, thank you. So as you can see, we've got great panelists here for you today. So we're going to go through some questions, but we also want your questions as well. So please use the Q&A as Richard said. So I'm going to start with you, Mark. And basically, let's open this up. So is online fraud an evolution of traditional fraud, or is it essentially the same but just in a different platform?
Well, it's a bit of both, really. There are lots of online frauds which are really just, if you like, turbocharged, souped up old versions of traditional fraud. So, for instance, 10, 20 years ago, lots of people received letters inviting them to participate in all kinds of things, which were basically scams. Obviously now that can be done by email. 10, 20, 30 years ago, people would go and buy things in shops. Now we buy things online through eBay and other websites. So part of the online change has been the traditional frauds now taking place online, and that's obviously much easier and can be done on a much more industrialized scale. But also the technological changes have enabled new forms of frauds to occur. So if we take, for instance, social networking, 20, 30 years ago, we would engage with people, friends, develop romances all in, face-to-face context. Now that's the common means of many people communicating, finding love, etc. So we've had new types of frauds emerge, like romance frauds, which 20, 30 years ago we wouldn't have had. And then there's also the more, if you like, cyber dependent related frauds that have emerged related to things like hacking, which are completely new. So it's a bit of a mixture of both, but all of them obviously pose a major risk to people out there, and obviously have meant that, when you look at individual victims and the Home Office figures, these types of crimes now account for almost half of all crime.
Okay, cool. Great start there. So Amber, can I bring you in on this one as well? What are your thoughts then? Is it an evolution or just sort of repackaged and put online for us?
To be honest, I kind of agree actually with what Mark has said. I think a lot of the fraud we see is kind of driven by consumer behaviour. That's the opportunity that kind of criminals look for, and without kind of making it sound so simple, I kind of think some of these criminals are actually just glorified marketers. They look for an opportunity and they essentially build on it. So, for example, what Mark was saying about a lot of the things before would be through the post, yes, that still happens. However, with the internet now, reach is actually much greater. If you think about, say, the Internet of Things, for example, how many of us have a device that's now connected to the internet? I think they're going to predict something like 35 billion devices next year will be connected to the internet, and that's a great opportunity for criminals, for the likes of hacking, to find out personal information, but also it's also in terms of how we use the internet now, what we actually do with it. In terms of our kind of behaviour online, for instance, we're all using social media networks. Actually, what are we putting out there about ourselves? How much is that facilitating some of the fraud that we're seeing? And similarly, we don't have to worry just about the dark web anymore. The normal internet is quite a key issue at the moment, because the amount of forums that are selling personal information, that also like giving services or hacking, fraud is a service, it is a business model. And actually, that is the thing. We need to be braver as society reporting some of this stuff as well. But actually, it's kind of just enhancing what's there. It's giving them the mechanism to go a little bit more global.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And finally, David, sort of what are your sort of opening thoughts then about sort of online fraud and the evolution? And so maybe what are you seeing within sort of the financial and the banking sectors?
So I agree it is an evolution, but it's an evolution that mirrors society. The reality is now we're conducting more and more of our activities online. This is both at home and at work. So the opportunity is available now for criminals to exploit a vast, and potentially they can catch people out when people are less on their guard, so they're least expecting it. I mean, we've seen a huge increase in crime in relation to remote purchase fraud. This would be a card not present transactions. This is where someone is making purchases online without the card physically being present. This would generally be a result of an account takeover, or again, authorised push payments. This is where someone is socially engineered to paying away their own money. So these are crimes that would have traditionally never existed. So they're an evolution in themselves, but again, one that mirrors consumer behaviour across the board.
Okay, cool. So sort of, and I'll bring this back to you, Mark. Maybe you know, are there certain frauds now that you think are are just very common with the online sort of world? And you've mentioned about romance frauds and things like that, but are there certain frauds that we should be particularly aware of with being online?
I'd say, particularly in the current context, that where we're all locked down, online shopping related frauds, whereby you might be tricked into paying for goods that never arrive, or goods that don't meet the requirements of what were advertised, or just simply websites that are there to kind of try and harvest the information, your personal information. So I think in that context, those types of frauds are some of the most common types of frauds out there. Obviously, things like romance frauds are much more focused upon those people actually out there, seeking romance at the moment. That's obviously going to be a smaller proportion, but things like buying stuff, that is going to be something that we all do on a very large scale.
All right, Max, you're on mute.
Sorry,
there we go.
Right, here we go. Sorry, David, if I could bring you back in on this as well. So, you're talking about some sort of new types of frauds you were seeing in sort of push payment and card not present. Are there any particular sort of tactics that you've seen that fraudsters are starting to use in the online environment to sort of help them to accomplish this that they wouldn't be able to use previously?
It was touched on by Professor Mark Button in relation to the harvesting of details. So that's obviously a threat that we're all aware of in terms of the safety of our banking details, and then the fear that if a criminal has possession of your banking details, the very vast damage they can do with your specific particulars, and they can spend away your money very quickly. So it's just to make sure that we're all aware of what we need to be doing around protecting our own details and making sure they can't be used by criminals.
Okay, and Amber, we hopefully, your microphone's a little bit clearer now. But sort of touching on what you are, are there certain tactics that you're seeing that criminals are using online now that maybe they weren't being able to use in the past?
Yeah, I think one of the things, is that a bit better if you can nod your head and let me know?
Yeah, that's good for me, thank you.
Is it good for you? So essentially, some of the things that we're seeing is some of that kind of more positive interaction with potential victims. So, historically, in terms of kind of some of these paying up extortion schemes, you'd see, if you get a red box come up on your computer screen, which says, you need to call this number and hand over your money. Now that kind of instigates a bit of a nervous reaction, whereas some of the things like, oh, if you share this, you can win a voucher, or, oh, if you complete this survey, you can get money off. For example, Just Eat, I mean, I'll put my hands up, I spotted this one, I was like, wow, that's great, and I thought, hang on a minute, no one gives you something for nothing here, there's got to be something behind it. And I think the thing is that they prey on the kind of needs, the wants, and the fears that we have. So particularly at the moment, a lot of the things that we are seeing are in particular in relation to COVID. Protect yourself, buy these items, or kind of sign up for free vouchers, that kind of thing. I think this is the problem, and they take advantage of that, and that's one of the challenges that we have as organisations in preventing fraud, is putting the messages out there as the latest thing to look at, because it changes on a daily basis. So, one of the key things I always say is, if you're on social media and you see a kind of post about sharing something to win, I don't know, a free Domino's voucher for pizza, always think about it before you click on that link, because actually, where's your information going once you've done that? And that's one of the things that we're seeing. They're kind of having that more positive interaction with their victims, and also with the social engineering aspect. you know, phoning up pretending to be your financial institution, actually they're very convincing, you know. And I think this is the thing that people are scared of now. I always say, don't be afraid to hang up. Actually, call that number on the back of your card if you seriously think your bank has called you, because actually that is the one way you can make sure that your bank is definitely contacting you.
Okay, yeah, some really good advice there. And actually, it's interesting you brought in sort of the social engineering aspects that you're seeing online. So, David, actually, if I could bring you back in on here, because you mentioned at the start that you look at sort of social engineering a lot within the DCPCU. Is that a tactic you're seeing more and more of now? And is it just online, or are they using a multiple of online and telephone and letters, or sort of how have you seen that evolve sort of within your role?
Yeah, so it's victim dependent and crime type dependent. So we've still got courier fraud, which is a problem where individuals are calling up those that are vulnerable in societies, the elderly or with other vulnerabilities, and purporting to be from a trusted organisation or a police officer. And these are crimes that are conducted via the telephone. People are persuaded that the individual on the other end of the phone is a police officer. They're advised that their account has been compromised, and what they then do is they're fooled into believing that they are assisting the police in an operation. They're told that a courier will come around and collect their bank cards, and these individuals then pass it with their bank cards, which again the individuals will use to spend that victim's money. So this is a traditional crime type that's conducted via the telephone, but it's generally a certain victim profile that will be a victim to that. It will be those that are elderly and the most vulnerable. But then again, if you move into the online space, again, the demographic of victims in that space can be much younger. So completely varied dependent on crime type.
Okay, bro. And Mark, if I could bring you back in now. We've talked a little bit about how, there's a lot of crime online, but there's also a lot of, do you think we are more susceptible to falling victim online or actually offline, or do we take more risks online, do you feel? Is there any sort of correlation between our online behaviour and how we would act offline?
I think we are more susceptible online, and you've really got to look at it. Just imagine a pensioner. A pensioner sat at home, maybe surfing the internet, gradually getting used to all the different things, online banking, communicating with family, buying things, a whole new world for that pensioner. 20, 30 years ago, that pensioner would have been very safe from crime, although obviously their fear of crime might have been higher. It'd been highly likely they would have gone to a kind of, a dangerous area. But once we switch on our computers, we are connected to the whole world. And that world includes a lot of potential fraudsters. And I've used the example of a pensioner, but obviously that could also apply to anyone else. So I think many of us are still learning, how to engage and manage the risks of these new environments. And added to that, I think one of the most striking things is impersonation is so easy online. Skilled fraudsters can very easily copy websites, copy emails, utilize the code. And we're in a rush. You get an email, it looks like it's from your bank or from some other organization you're actually buying something from. It's very real. Or you search the internet, you think you're going to a particular website, but it turns out it's a copied fake website. So I think for all of those reasons, we are much more susceptible to this type of crime.
Thank you. And I'll pose the same question to you then, Amber. I can see you nodding a bit through there. So I just wondered if there's anything you wanted to add about, we're more susceptible online or sort of offline, so to speak.
I think it's very dependent on the situation at the moment. So, for example, at the moment, obviously working from home actually causes quite a few risks. So, for example, if you receive an email from what you think is your CEO saying, "Oh, can you make a transaction?" Well, actually, at the moment, kind of that's how we're communicating with each other. So it's always wise to then give your CEO a call, or at least his PA, just to check that that is a legitimate transaction that you are supposed to be taking up. And I think actually, it is easy for impersonation online because of the fact that as we're becoming more digital, information is becoming more transparent. So there is more information about us out there. And I think that personal information is less valuable for the criminals to use, because essentially I could go on Facebook, LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great source for finding information about someone. You can go on things like that. If they're a blogger, TripAdvisor, you can go, if you even know a bit of where they live, you can go on the likes of Zoopla and find out when the property was last bought. And if you think of all the kind of security questions you get asked, actually, building up a very good picture of who you are. And then to make an application in your name online, actually, because a lot of the process is now, it's speedy onboarding. There's a lot of pressure from financial institutions to give bank accounts very quickly. And I think that's one of the issues that we have, is actually the pressures of meeting the balance between providing a service, but also if we do lots of diligence on who's applying for a product, does that then mean there's more friction? So if the friction is bad, actually, is that really what the customer wants? And I think as a society, do we want more convenience than our security at the moment?
Okay, sorry, Amber, we might be losing your feed a little bit. So I'll throw this open to Mark and to David. Sort of, how do you think our days sort of online now, and that sort of aspect that sort of Amber was sort of touching on there? Have you got any thoughts about sort of the amount of information that might be available to criminals online now, and are they able to easily exploit this now, do you think?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, please.
I think there's a huge amount of information. And Amber's touched upon some of those things, like where you live, your date of birth, the names of your children, your names of your pets. All these kinds of things can be quite easily found online. And if you're a fairly skilled online researcher, you can find even more information, with some of the databases that that people can gain access to, particularly if someone is a professional that has a profile, has some kind of registration, some kind of directorship, those types of things. So a lot of that information is readily available, and it does always worry me when one of the questions the banks ask you is what's your date of birth, and what's your mother's maiden name, when those things can be so easily found online.
Okay, David, do you have any sort of comments on that one?
No, I agree with Amber. It's a very difficult discussion right now in terms of what do we want as consumers? Do we want that frictionless journey, or do we want to be better protected? And it's about making sure that we all find that balance that we're comfortable with. And again, in terms of what Professor Mark Button mentioned, it is frightening in terms of how much information there is readily available about yourself out there. So it's about making sure that we're all aware of that, so we are potentially aware of what criminals could get their hands on if they wanted to.
Okay, bro. So what I want to do now is I want to bring Rich back in, because I can see we've had a few questions that have come through. So Rich, if I can just hand over to you quickly, if you could sort of give us any questions that we've had from our viewers, please.
Yeah, sure. So we've had a comment or some advice for people to go onto YouTube and look at someone called Jim Browning, who apparently has some really useful videos on there. I haven't seen them myself, but someone's written it into the chat section that they're really handy and really easy to understand. We've also had a very specific question, which I think Dave might be able to be ideally placed to answer. And that's that someone has recently ordered a watch online in response to a Facebook ad. They've given all of their card details over, and now they can't find the advert. They've been told by this company, who apparently are located in China, that they're having problems with sending it over, and they're now concerned about having given all of their card details over. What should they do? That one's probably more to David as advice from a policing side.
Yeah, so in the first instance, contact your bank, let them know that there's a transaction that may be going ahead that you're uncomfortable with. Ask them to cancel that transaction. If you are unfortunately a victim of a fraud, what we'd ask you to do is to report that to Action Fraud, and that will prevent other people becoming victim of this crime if it is a crime. But first and foremost, what I want you to do is contact your bank, let them know about this transaction that you're unhappy with, and see if you can cancel it there to stop yourself becoming a victim of crime.
That's great. Thank you, David. And there was one more, which kind of the panel were picking up on anyway, but do they think that banks and financial institutions are doing enough to prevent fraud and take the responsibility for that themselves?
Okay, who wants to answer that one then?
You know, obviously banks are they do have their hands tied. So faster payments, for instance, they need to make these transactions quicker, but similarly, they need to open bank accounts for people. They are doing a lot of work, and they are working with the likes of in terms of social media. You know, some of the adverts that we are seeing, can we take them down? But I think there also needs to be a degree of what we do as if we see these things, we should report them to places like Action Fraud, because actually, you know, other people are seeing it. It's a bit like with the toilet roll situation. I think, you know, everyone kind of knows it needs changing, but no one really does it, and they kind of wait for someone to do it. And similarly, that's kind of similar to what we see online. If we're seeing people that are kind of selling personal information, selling financial information, offering services, we should be empowered to be able to report that. And I think there is in terms of what kind of the likes of the big internet providers could do around how we could actually report that through a mechanism. But it's, you know, they are doing what they can, and I think that's the thing. You know, we also need to be very mindful of what we do, so what we put out there, and also, you know, do listen to the advice that's given out around if you get a kind of phone call, if someone wants to your application through remote desktop, for example, you know, actually check it is your bank that want to do that, that want to see your personal information.
Okay, I'll bring in Mark and David quickly. And one thing that was sort of touched upon a little bit was sort of, you mentioned like the online shopping. How have you guys seen sort of our behaviours with regards to online shopping evolve? Because I see there's you know, a lot of marketplaces now in terms of on social media accounts or on auction sites, and do you sort of see these as particularly risky areas for consumers, or, you know, should they be able to shop on them with the same level of sort of confidence as they would on a traditional online sales company?
Shall I go first? I think, first of all, shopping online has increased massively, and obviously, particularly at the moment where, you know, we're confined to our homes, it is the only way to do, you know, most of your shopping. And I've certainly been buying a lot more things online, you know, in the last few weeks. I think, you know, it's like walking into a high street in many ways. You know, there are certain, you know, established brands out there that you can be, you know, much more confident of buying from. But obviously, once you start going into kind of lesser known websites, and particularly, you know, from buyers based abroad, then you start to kind of increase the risk that this could be a fraud. And you've just really got to do your research if it's a website that you've you know, not come across before, to try and identify if it is a legitimate website. And I know that's not a kind of easy thing to do, but, you know, that is the challenge. And, you know, my advice would be, if you're still in any doubt and you're kind of looking at a website to buy something, and then just don't do it. And obviously, if you do it, use the credit card, you know, because that's your best chance, if it is a fraud, of getting your money back.
Yeah, good advice. Anything you'd like to add on that one, David?
It's very difficult because, again, as consumers, we're doing more and more of our shopping online. We've only got to look outside of our windows now and see the DHL drivers pull up into all of our neighbours' driveways to understand just how much that becomes a normal behaviour, that people are doing all of their shopping online. From a personal perspective, what I like to try and do is always purchase goods from a trusted seller, and then always utilising an independent link to get onto that website. So I would never be clicking on links that were sent through on a text message. If I was to purchase something from a well-known supermarket, I wouldn't click on any link that I was sent. I would make sure that I was entering that well-known supermarket straight into a search engine, as opposed to going through a link which would potentially take me onto a fraudulent site, which they could then potentially harvest my details from. So it's being aware in terms of that threat and what we can do to mitigate it.
Excellent. And that's actually brings us on quite nicely sort of to our next sort of topic of discussion. And this is actually like how can people and individuals avoid sort of becoming victims to online fraud or to fraud in general. And I know you sort of already touched on some advice there. But so I'll start with you, Mark. Have you got any sort of frauds that you're sort of seeing commonly at the moment, and then some advice about how you can better protect yourself, but not only for individuals, but also for businesses?
I think, as David mentioned, you know, some of the advice in shopping and things that I've already mentioned beforehand, but I think obviously phishing attacks, I think, are quite common at the moment. And I think, you know, one of the things that I've seen emerge with businesses is that, you know, sort of fake texts, emails, websites, impersonating government type bodies where you can access grants, loans, etc. And, you know, the advice that David said about sort of clicking on unsolicited links is always very high risk. You know, search out for those websites directly yourself as the kind of best means to kind of identify that, you know, the website which is legitimate. I think for individuals, you know, I think a key thing is obviously to use your credit card when you do buy things. That's your best chance of getting your money back. And I think, other than the advice I've already given in terms of shopping, I think those are the kinds of things that individuals should be thinking about.
Okay, brilliant. And you talked about sort of crimes that are new because of sort of online in terms of romance frauds. Again, is that very much about sort of staying on trusted sites, or is there any other advice that you could give to people?
Well, in terms of romance websites, I suppose the key thing is to use the established romance websites and to utilize their channels of communication. As someone who hasn't dated for a long time, you know, and I don't know the ins and outs of how these websites operate, but from what I understand, you know, one of the tactics fraudsters use is to try and take people offline onto, you know, different means of communication as a means to then try and target them. And I suppose, you know, for anyone to be thinking about giving money to someone that you know, they haven't met in person, and have a kind of clear you know, understanding of who and what they are, you know, always try and avoid that. I know the way a lot of these sources operate, that is very difficult with the time pressures, the emotional things that they put across. But I think, you know, the key thing is to kind of avoid, you know, handing over money.
Okay, great. And David, is there any sort of particular advice you would like to give for individuals and also for businesses?
Yeah, the same advice would go across both individuals and businesses. It's effectively that standardised take 5 advice that I've always kind of believed in personally as well, which is effectively stop, challenge and protect. The stop advice is in relation to just take a moment to think about what you're doing before you actually part with your money. The challenge part of it is, could it actually be fake in terms of what it is that you've been asked to do? It's okay to reject, refuse or ignore requests, and the reality is it's only criminals that will try to rush you or panic you. Genuine members of business and organisations won't try that tactic on you. So if you are feeling unduly pressured or put under any sort of coercion to do something, think to yourselves, could this be a scam? Then lastly, it's around protection. So I know I answered one of the questions earlier around what you should be doing. Firstly, it's contacting your bank to make sure that you can stop yourself becoming a victim of fraud and losing your money if you have parted with your bank details. And then after that, you report it to Action Fraud.
Okay, some great advice there. And Amber, hopefully you're back with us on a better line. What advice would you give to our viewers in terms of as an individual, but then also as a business? What can businesses be doing to better protect themselves?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. Hopefully you can hear me now, and it all sounded a lot better. We've got some nods. That's always great. So essentially, the thing is, it's kind of what Dave's already said, is that if you are getting an email which kind of has offers, for example, for shopping, actually do some research into whether or not that is a legitimate company that are trying to sell you something. So always go into your browser and put the link, the name of the company, and just check it out a little bit. Similarly, for businesses as well, particularly at the moment, there is a lot of phishing going on. And I think one of the key things is, if you're not expecting email or post or a telephone call, don't be afraid, like we've already said, to stop, to challenge it. You know, it's not a problem. You are perfectly entitled to do that. And I think one of the things to really look out for is, we've seen some horrific grammar on some of these kind of phishing emails. I saw an example last week where, you know, at the moment people are volunteering for local authorities to help, particularly for those that can't get out, those that are vulnerable. And actually those volunteers are being targeted by phishing emails. But the language in it, and, you know, we've kind of alluded to it, it's very urgent. You know, there's always a, you must do it now kind of thing. And in this case, it was, oh, you need to look at this video to see if you've got what it takes. So it was a bit of a guilt trip within the kind of language used within that email. You know, actually, that's not how you would be corresponded with if you're part of a local authority volunteer project. So if you get something like that, don't be afraid to check it, and always check the address that it's come from. You know, the amount of DVLA emails that I've looked at, for example, where if I've then gone into the email address sendee, actually, no, it's not from DVLA at all. And I think it's very difficult when you're on a mobile device in particular, because if you're looking at emails on a mobile device, it doesn't always have that URL at the top if you're scrolling through, or it doesn't have the sender address in it. So always make sure you scroll up and check before you click on anything. I mean, I'm quite suspicious of everything now, so I don't click on any links in emails. Even when I got this Zoom one today, I was a bit like, should I click on that link? So I think actually, you know, definitely take that moment, think, challenge it if you have to, not a problem.
Okay, great advice. It's actually great to see that you're all very sort of consistent with that advice as well. So actually there's some really clear guidance and messages there. So great, thank you. Rich, can we bring you back in and see if we've got any more questions, please?
Yeah, so we've got quite a few around the whole awareness and being better protected. I'm just going to read them out how they're written down. So the first one, and the most popular one, is, which awareness mechanisms do you find the most effective in informing consumers about common frauds? We also have, what resources would the panel recommend for staying up to date with current and popular fraud trends and threats? And the one which I think you've just covered there is, any practical tips to protect the vulnerable people over the phone?
Let's go with the first question. So do you want to just read out that first question again, Rich, and then we'll open it up to all?
Yeah, sure. So which awareness mechanisms do you find the most effective in informing consumers about common fraud?
Well, I think from our perspective, so I'm going to jump in. From our perspective, actually, it's being able to relate to the consumer is always the key thing, you know, and I think if we give some messages out that really don't relate to anyone, then it's quite difficult for you to absorb that. I mean, you know, there is the thing of, oh, do we call them? Do we call people? No, we don't call people, because if you're a victim, there is no way that you will want to talk to someone via email or via the phone. And I think one of the things that we find is getting out our fraud prevention messages, actually, dare I say it, via social media. The amount of times that people pick up on things that we put on Twitter, for example, seem to be quite effective. And I think it depends who the audience is, who are we trying to target. I think generally that there are a lot of kind of avenues for advice. And actually, it's just making sure at the moment gov.uk have a great website around kind of some of the advice, which is actually a bit more joined up. It's from all the partner agencies, including law enforcement, ourselves, UK Finance, and actually having a kind of a one voice for some of this messaging really helps. I think we need to get better as industry at doing that.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you about like the one voice, one message is key, about sort of cutting through the noise, I think, with that clear message. So I open it up to David and to Mark. Do you have any sort of thoughts, feelings about how's the best way to sort of advise people with fraud protect messaging?
Yes, to Get Safe Online is always a really useful resource. So getsafeonline.org will give you kind of up-to-date advice, and it will talk to you about the different trends that we're seeing in terms of as criminals adapt, crimes adapt. It will kind of give a consumer current and relevant advice in relation to that, and also the Action Fraud website. So both of those resources can kind of give you real up-to-date information about what we're seeing as law enforcement and other government organisations and what people can do to protect themselves.
And finally, Mark, in your experience with fraud, has there been anything that you found worked really well in terms of advising people or getting the messaging like across in a clear and succinct way?
Well, first of all, I'll just add one extra one. I think the National Cyber Security Centre has also got some really good advice on preventing, some of the more cyber dependent type scams and frauds that emerge. I think I'd really go back to what Amber said, and that's, it really depends on the audience. Some of the kind of successful campaigns out there, relate to largely the type of victim that's been targeted and the type of scam. Courier scams are generally aimed at pensioners. I don't think social media would be, kind of the best way to target those groups, but obviously ticketing scams related to concerts, generally target at younger people, so raising awareness through social media where young people are much more engaged with that, I think is the best way. And I think for each of those types of scams, you've got to use the best possible means to target those groups. What is the most successful of all is much more difficult to say. I mean, there hasn't been a huge amount of research evaluating, different types of campaigns that have been utilised in this area.
Okay, and Rich, what was the second point you had in your questions, please, mate?
So you've answered the other one, but we also have, do you have any practical tips to protect vulnerable people whilst on the phone?
Again,
I can answer that. That helps. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Again, it's just to echo what I mentioned earlier. It's around that, tell the vulnerable people out there, or if anyone's got any vulnerable people in their lives, that simple messaging around stop, challenge and protect. That stop, do let people take a second to think about what it is they're going to be doing before they do it and before they part with their money. And again, do not be afraid to challenge people. So challenge people if they're telling you they're from the bank or telling you from the police. Make sure that you challenge that, and then you go into that organisation via a recognised external link. So if someone tells you they're from your bank and you're not happy about that, which you shouldn't be if someone's calling you up, end that phone call, make sure you've ended that phone call, and then, like it was touched on by Amber earlier on this call, then you call that bank yourself using a recognised number for that bank. And then lastly, it's around the protection. If anyone out there does become a victim of crime, first and foremost, contact your bank, stop the money being paid away, and then secondly, contact Action Fraud.
Great advice. Amber, anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there are obviously various ways that you can kind of protect yourself from cold calling, if you like. So, for instance, Trading Standards have their kind of call blocker device. Also, a lot of providers now offer that kind of call shielding. I mean, I've got it on my phone, to be honest, because we were getting quite a few calls to the landline. And although it's kind of a little bit painful if you're trying to get through to someone, because it kind of, you have to confirm if you want to talk to them and that kind of thing. Actually, it's quite good from that kind of making you think, oh, do I recognise this number? Do I recognise who's calling me? Do I really want to talk to that person? It kind of makes you take that second as to whether or not this is a call you really want to take. But I also think the kind of Friends Against Scams scheme as well, that kind of Trading Standards run, does have some useful information on there that you can pass on to those more vulnerable people within your communities. And I know a lot of neighbourhood watches are kind of tied up with those kind of schemes as well. So I think the first thing is really identifying who is vulnerable in your community, and actually in that way then you know sort of who needs that advice. I mean, you know, like Mark kind of touched on, actually in terms of social media for some of these groups isn't actually appropriate. Is a leaflet through the door more appropriate, or that kind of face-to-face interaction? I think we're losing that face-to-face interaction as we're going more digital now, which is making it harder to identify someone. Well, I say if someone's genuine or not. We obviously still have those people knocking on doors, impersonating police officers and road tradesmen, but it's still that human interaction part that's really important. And I think if we can build a community that looks after the vulnerable as well and helps instill that message, then it kind of supports what we're trying to put across as fraud prevention messages.
Okay, great, thank you. So the final sort of topic I wanted to cover, and we've looked at sort of how we thought it's been an evolution of traditional crime, sort of what are the tactics people might be using, and actually how we can sort of help protect ourselves. So what I'd like to sort of ask you guys now is what do you think sort of the future of online fraud might look like, and where can you see this sort of going in the future? So I'll just start with you, Mark, if you will.
Well, I think the first thing is it's going to continue to be a problem. It's going to grow. I mean, it probably won't grow as fast as it has the last 5 to 10 years because people, organisations, the police, etc., are all catching up. But you've got to look at it from a criminal's point of view. Should they go out and burgle houses or rob banks, or should they perpetrate frauds online and various types of cybercrimes? It's much easier, for them to do this. They can make much more money. The sentences are lesser. I think you look at those background factors. It's going to continue to be a problem, continue to grow. As we've seen through the current crisis, frauds are always changing and to meet the kind of current situation. So some of the interesting things that we've seen emerge over the last few weeks, from fake selling of face masks to phishing attacks, seeking information from businesses through the government support schemes for during this crisis. Those all emerge very quickly by the kind of, if you like, entrepreneurial scammers that are out there, and that's going to continue. So I'm afraid that it's bad news in the sense that this is going to continue to occur, but it probably won't increase at the same rates that it has done over the last 4 or 5 years.
Okay, great. And Amber, what are your thoughts then? Where do you see online fraud going in the future?
Well, I think the key thing really is that fraud is like a business model now. It's not just the one person in their dark, dingy room attacking a business or an organisation. Actually, it's quite well set up, and these different groups talk to each other for services as well. So, I've witnessed it where they've kind of been like, oh, I've managed to get lots of money. Does anyone know how I can cash it out? And someone's like, oh yeah, private message me. I can tell you how to do it. So it's kind of become a bit of a business model now. And as I made reference to earlier, a bit of a fraud as a service. You can buy phishing kits, you can buy smishing kits, or the other ishing kits. You can buy kind of how to socially engineer someone, a step-by-step guide. There's all these things available now, and they're sharing it quite openly as well with each other. I think the thing that's quite interesting to see is actually if we as society accept the fact, for example, that our personal information is out there, we accept that fact, how do we then make that less valuable? How can it then mean less for someone to then abuse it and take advantage of it? I think one of the key things that we have definitely seen over the past year, identity fraud for us has gone through the roof over the last 5 years. It's been like a kind of a massive increase. And facility takeover, so someone taking over accounts like bank accounts, has gone up like 105% over 5 years. And that's potentially because of the stuff we're putting out there. but also because of the fact that everything is so easily accessible now, we're becoming more transparent with data, we're becoming more digital with it. And I think the problem is, as kind of Mark alluded to, is it's never going to go away, because they're very quick to evolve, some of these criminals, you know, like with the COVID situation. Within a week, there's like masses of thousands of malicious domains have been set up. You know, it's quite quick for them to do, and it will always be a challenge. However, it's one that we accept with a full heart in terms of actually protecting people and making sure that we can make a difference.
Great, thank you. Finally, David, is there anything you would like to add? How do you see the future of fraud moving, certainly within your department as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't answer any differently to your other two panellists. The reality is, like they both touched on, it's difficult to predict because criminals will always adapt. They've shown this throughout this COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the emergence almost instantaneously of, we all received a text message from UK government. Within hours, we were seeing fraudulent smishing text messages being sent out with illicit URLs embedded within them, so criminals could capture your banking details and your personal information. And that was done, again, within hours of the UK government text message being sent out. So it's about being aware of that. It's difficult to predict because criminals will adapt, and they'll adapt to the circumstances that they find themselves in. I think what we've shown throughout this COVID-19 pandemic is if you do work together, so throughout this pandemic, it's been law enforcement, financial organisations and the network providers that have worked together to try and identify the individuals behind these smishing campaigns. Then we've successfully managed to target those individuals that are sending out these illicit text messages and making sure that there is a decent law enforcement response to target the criminals that are impacting against us all.
Great, thank you. Finally, Rich, is there any more questions for the panellists?
The only real question, which I think you may have just answered there, Dave, was how the authorities are going to work to now counter this fraud as it is now and in the future.
Yeah, so the reality is we've got to work together. So not one organisation holds all the answers. So it's about identifying what the threat is at any one time, working out which organisation holds the information, holds the intelligence, then getting around the table, working out together who those criminals are and making sure that we're focusing our resources on tackling those individuals, organising the crimes that many, many victims are becoming a victim of.
Great, thank you. And I was going to actually sort of add on that, David. Is there any sort of particular challenges that you, in like law enforcement, are facing at the moment with online fraud? And like we said, there's the boundaries probably are not what they used to be. Like how do you, would you go around sort of an investigation potentially?
So online fraud does have its challenges to investigate because you do have the boundary challenges and then you have a resource challenge around that as well. So it may well be that an offender is committing an online fraud abroad. Then you've got to have that real kind of discussion with yourselves. Is it in the public interest to spend X amount of money investigating an individual who's based abroad for a lower level fraud? Potentially not. So it's about targeting your resources on those individuals causing the most harm, and if they are abroad and they are causing significant harm, it's working with the relevant authorities that are based overseas to try and tackle and take on those criminals.
Great, thank you. And thank you for everyone for joining us today, and thank you for you guys for watching. This webinar is part of a series of webinars. So I'd just like to hand over to Rich quickly, who's going to just show you some of the other webinars that we have coming up and how you can sign up for them.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Thank you again for all of your questions and comments in the chat section. We haven't been able to answer them all, unfortunately. And also, once this webinar closes down, they will all disappear. So if you want to keep a log of the chat that's happened there, my suggestion is to quickly copy and paste it somewhere now before the end of the session. I'm just going to talk you through how to keep up to date with the rest of this series of these webinars. So I'll just share my screen with you. So the first thing you can do is, if you're on LinkedIn, go onto the Cyber Griffin webpage, and on here we will post every single session that we have, which will be every Monday and Thursday, coming to you from different places around the UK. However, the best way to keep track of things is to get on the Eventbrite page. Into the search box, just type in National Policing, and you should see a whole load of different options come up. Go on to any of the ones on there from the National Policing series, then scroll down that page, and this will take you through to the list of events we've got coming up in chronological order. From here, you can either follow us or you can sign up to each and every event that we've got coming up. So the next one, as I just said, is part of a series, is coming up on Monday. It's being brought to you by our colleagues in the Southwest region. It's a real interesting one because they're actually going to take you through a real life cybercrime investigation involving IoT, or internet connected devices. So it's going to be a real interesting point of view, and something definitely to sign up for. So that one's on Monday from 2 till 3. You can register through on the Eventbrite page and keep up to date with all the rest of the series. Thanks, Max.
Thank you very much, Rich. So thank you very much for joining us, and it just gives me a fun chance to thank our guests. So thank you very much to Mark Button, thank you very much to Amber, and thank you very much to David for joining us. Your answers have all been excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us for this session. Hopefully you found it interesting and you've been able to get some practical tips. Some of the places which advice was offered was for Tape 5, which you could go and find. There's also CyberAware, and there's also the National Cyber Security Centre, where you can go and get some really good practical tips to help keep yourself safe and also your organisations. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you can join us on the future webinars in the future of this series. Thank you very much.